Thank you and welcome to the show this morning. The topic this morning is the World Conference Against Racism, and we're fortunate to have with us to talk about the recent Race Conference Against Racism held in Durban, South Africa, Dr. CPoe12. And of course, Dr. Poe, let me welcome you to the show this morning and to talk about what I consider to be a very, very important topic, and that is the World Conference Against Racism. I'm sure that not many of our audience understand exactly what this conference was all about, and I think that you'll have an opportunity to inform us of that event. But before we get into that, Dr. Poe, let's talk about Dr. CPoe12, and to give you an opportunity to talk about some of the things that were important in your life that eventually led you to where we are now.
Well, Dr. Haney, of course, I am a Christian psychiatrist and a minister of the gospel here in Nashville, Tennessee. I'm a former pastor. I served as interim pastor of Spruce Street Baptist Church here in Nashville, and then pastor of First Community Church here in Nashville. Over the last 8 months, I've been coordinating an effort involving numbers of persons, approximately 8 to 10 people, who are interested in forming an institute for the study of racism and health here in Nashville, Tennessee. And so because of that, I decided that it would be good for me to go to Durban, South Africa, and attend the World Conference Against Racism.
Let's talk about this World Conference Against Racism, Dr. Poe. When you talk about the World Conference Against Racism, are you saying that all of the nations, the overwhelming majority of the nations of the world, came together to talk about this issue of racism?
There were many, many nations there. I don't have a specific count, but there were many, many nations there from all over the world. And as you know, the U.S. Initially decided not to come and then did send a watered-down delegation to the conference. Of course, you know, Israel did come for a while, but the U.S. Then subsequently left. But yes, I would say most nations around the world were represented at that conference.
Now, how long did this conference last?
This conference lasted for a total of 2 weeks. The first week was a meeting of the non-governmental organizations. These were groups from various countries throughout the world who were involved in the struggle against racism in one form or the other. Some were fighting the problem of classism, the problem of racism against the Dalits and India. This is 260 million people who used to be referred to as the untouchables. Others were there talking about the issues of poverty in South America. Others were talking about the problems of the Aborigines in Australia. Then we had others talking about the issue of covert racism in Canada. So we had people from all over the world talking about racism in its various manifestations.
But all of them agreed upon the problem of racism. You know, as a psychiatrist, how would you define racism? I mean, within the context of how the World Conference used its definition of that word.
Well, now, my definition is that racism is an expression of self-hate. If I hate myself, then it's almost impossible not to hate you and not to hate other people. But I feel that we're all members of one race, and that is the human race created by God. And so if I hate one person, whether that person is of the same ethnic identity or of a different ethnic identity, then I believe I've got a problem of racism.
And so racism is not necessarily directed toward one group. It's a person who is a racist is really a person who hates humanity in a real sense. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, I'm saying that racism is much larger and deeper than hostility or hatred towards a particular person or a particular ethnic group. If I'm a racist in relationship to blacks, then I'm also a racist in relationship to whites and Jews and Hispanics.
And so it's a human problem. That
it's a human problem. It involves the problem of self-hate extending itself to involve other people.
Well, now, how was it possible to get all of these nations together? And I know that the results might not have been as encouraging as some folks wanted those results to be, but how did you get, how was it possible to get all of these folks together on at least a common theme, a common agreement in reference to this?
Well, my understanding, this was a second World Conference on Racism, but I think it was the first one that involved the non-governmental organizations. They invited non-governmental people in, rather than just the nations. It was sponsored by the United Nations, specifically the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights was the person who coordinated the conference.
And he called this conference together in South Africa. Well, why was South Africa selected for this particular conference?
I don't know, except perhaps the fact that South Africa, being an example of a nation that had a real severe problem with racism, apartheid racism, and in 1994, with the election of Nelson Mandela, the apartheid legislation was dismantled. And so I think South Africa then offers the image of hope, a nation that used to have legalized racism and now is moving toward freedom and equality for all people.
Now, you were there for approximately 2 weeks. What was your impression of what had happened in South Africa, having known South Africa before 1994 and after? I mean, how did you feel that things had changed, or did you see any manifestations of things not having changed as much as perhaps they should have changed? Talk about it from your own personal point of view.
Well, under apartheid, if you were a black African, you had to have a pass to go downtown, and particularly if you remained downtown after 7 p.m. You couldn't be downtown. Also, if you were a black South African under apartheid, you could not own a business. And you were confined to living in a certain part of the community. So you were severely restricted if you were a black African under apartheid. If you were colored, you had a little bit more freedom. If you were Indian, East Indian, you had a little bit more freedom. You could at least enter a business, you could own a business. And of course, if you were South African white, then there were essentially no restrictions on you. But now, the difference is that blacks have ascended to some degree politically. For example, after Mandela served as president, they elected another South African black. His name is Mbeki, and he's the president, and we got a chance to hear him speak, and I was very impressed. He seems to be a man of wisdom and a man of compassion. In addition, the mayor of Durban is a black man. So blacks are beginning to acquire some political power, but in terms of economic wherewithal or resources, business involvement, they still have a very long way to go.
And so racism might have dissipated somewhat in the political arena, which is to say that there are more more black Africans in political positions than ever before, in positions that they would not have been allowed to occupy prior to this time. Now, while changes have been made there, but you also, I believe that in some of these other areas, economic areas primarily, that's a real problem in terms of trying to bridge this gap between the haves, the have-nots, and those who... do you consider that to be a problem? Or what?
Yes, I mean the economic differential is a carryover from apartheid racism. There are other carryovers too. That's a real source of problems for South Africa right now. One is the poverty. Most of the poverty you'll find among South African blacks. Less so among South African Indians, less so among South African whites. Also, there's a problem of crime. And I interviewed many people, most of whom were cab drivers, and I asked them, why was there so much crime?
And of course, Dr. Poe, let me interrupt here for this first commercial break, which will give us an opportunity to come back to this issue of crime. And of course, we'll be back with our audience following this short commercial break. Good. Yeah. The guest is Dr. CPoe12.